As you think about the latest trends, some common business challenges that customers are trying to solve for, and maybe even certain, legislation or regulatory changes that customers are needing to meet, what recommendations or advice would you give to companies trying to get to net zero and benchmark their efforts?
Yeah, so a couple of things come to mind. I think that, the first has to be measurement. And, I think, and also measuring what matters, right? I think there's a challenge of losing focus, of trying to do too many things that are maybe not as material to your business. So I think that's very critical. I think, again, thinking about sort of moving the needle, I think collaboration is also very, very key, right? So, having that conversation, asking the question, will often open up a lot of doors, a lot of opportunities, but that's really critical to be doing that as well. And then lastly, I would say just reimagining what it is that, how you do business. I think for us, like the cloud, for example, I'm not going to say the cloud was because of the sustainability team coming up with some epiphany, but that is a different business model than what we had in the past. And when you think about the environmental benefits of really providing computing as a service rather than a product, which ultimately is what the customer wants, right? The hardware is sort of an ancillary thing. So by us sort of consolidating, driving more utilization, higher utilization rates, more centrally managing the power sources of the cloud, of what used to be on everyone's premise, that's a great opportunity. And it's just shifting the way a business thinks. And, luckily, in many cases, we're seeing that kind of servitization across lots of industries. And it really, I think, makes the problem a little bit more manageable. But, the bigger point is, just because you've always done it a certain way, reimagine, think about doing things differently and outside the box.
So to build upon what you're saying, Rich, and actually something that Nicola mentioned, we actually recently just finished a CEO study. So we spoke with about 1,200 CEOs across 113 countries, 21 industries. And there were a couple data points, and I think they echo what we were just saying. The first one is around measurements, and that they're struggling to manage those Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And really, how do they also advance nature-based solutions? And, really there, it's more about how do you accelerate research and development, right, in those solutions, and how do you make room for that? Another thing was in the enablement of new business models. But to echo what Rich said, that requires a data strategy, right? Because to really be able to understand data across your entire value chain, how you address affordability, how do you deal with knowledge constraints, that view of data, right? Whether it's for measurements, whether it's to really understand, how you leverage your suppliers and your vendors, that is something that I think every utility, every industry, and every company is really challenged to understand. And then finally, and I think this is the, how do you kind of start to look at it more globally, is, how do they increase the climate financing for the global South, right? If we think about globalization, how do they impact the broader whole? And I think at the end of the day, it's collaboration, right? It's how do they increase their business engagement in climate policy formation, because those are going to be the longer term, right? Everyone is starting with what they can control, within their walls, then how they impact, right, their customers and their employees, and then the next evolution then starts to really be, that more global impact. So it was interesting, right? What we're just talking about here, it's absolutely resonated in this recent study that we just did.
Yeah, and Doug, just to add to that too, in terms of the measurement piece, and particularly in terms of net zero, it's phenomenal that we've seen a lot of commitment from large organizations, right, to net zero. But frankly, in the past, as Laurence said, there are directly controlled emissions, or Scope 1 and 2 emissions, as they're called. We were all, we got a pretty good handle on that, and we driving towards that. But the value chain piece, the supply chain piece, was a bit of a gray, murky box, right? And a lot of us tackled that by basically using a spend-based approach, right? So using spend analytics and kind of multiplying through some emissions factors, which are generic to an industry. But it also gets back onto like, okay, well, how is this data going to help us drive change, right? So, and basically with that model, the only way to drive change is to spend less money. And we all try to spend as least money as we can, but we want to be more intelligent than that. So I think there's this level of precision that has to happen so that, again, you have to use the spend analytics, which is just, part of doing business for many organizations, but then have a precise emissions factor by supplier. So for those key suppliers, we want to get more information, right, as to what their exact footprint is, so that if they, to their credit, go out and do good things in their operations, we can, modify that and reward that as part of their evaluation process. So it's not rocket science, but you really need to have the data strategy and the data elements to kind of, on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month basis, execute against that. So that's very critical.
It's a fascinating challenge, I think, because as someone myself who started my career as an accountant and then was a CFO, right? Yeah. Business is so, the data is a lot new, but we're comfortable with dollars and cents or whatever currency you're operating in. Right. And so to answer questions like, what's the return on investment towards net zero or sustainability? It's a big challenge. And you're absolutely right, I think, pointing out like, wow, where do we get this data and how do we process and analyze that data? And how do we come up with constructs that help us answer like, the value and how we should prioritize these various investments? It's a new world for everybody.
And to appeal to your blessed accounting background, it's also becomes a risk, right? It's so now we have an exposure. Now, we've made a commitment to be net zero. And, and it's granted it's a long time off, although the other day I was having a conversation with a colleague, a young lady we just hired, and, it's in her working lifetime, right? So it's going to be here before we know it. But again, from an investor point of view, we want to quantify that risk, right? What is it going to cost us to address this issue, or if we don't address this issue?
Yeah, and I think the other side to the coin of the risk side, right, is that if you think about what we're trying to achieve as a humanity, is that we're trying to decarbonize our economies. And what that means is, yes, that's a challenge, but it's also that we're revolutionizing markets, right? And in a very short time frame. And what does that mean? That's a huge business opportunity for the companies that understand how to do that and can provide solutions. And one example is the number of companies that are signing up for science-based targets. And science-based targets are commitments to not only get your own carbon emissions of your own operations down to zero by some timeframe, 2030, 2050, but also that of your supply chain, as we've been talking about. And the supply chain is enormous compared to your own operations. So there's an incredible challenge there that all of these companies are looking for solutions, and that's a business opportunity. So what we're seeing is that companies are saying, okay, we set these goals, we need to be able to measure what is our carbon footprint of our own operations and that of our supply chain. So that's the first opportunity, right? Is if you can provide your customer with the carbon footprint of them using your service or product, that's going to satisfy their very basic, their first step need. And then you can imagine, you can't manage what you can't measure. Once you have that data then informs opportunities for improvement, opportunities for innovation. I think there was one amazing example I learned about a long time ago. So they were trying to reduce what's called their scope 3. So effectively, what's the carbon emissions of consumers using their products? And what they found was the biggest carbon footprint was in customers using hot water to wash their clothes using their detergent. And it was an enormous part of their carbon footprint. Say, well, what can we do about that? Well, if we can make a detergent that can clean clothes in cold water, then that's a huge reduction in the carbon footprint. And it's an innovation in our product. It saves our customers money. They can use cold water instead of hot water, et cetera. And then there's all kinds of examples of how you shrink the amount of the size of your laundry detergent because you're making it a concentration, which then reduces shipping emissions. So there's all kinds of examples, right, of once you start to focus using that lens of sustainability, and you have the data that then informs where your opportunities are. So I definitely think there's risk on that side, but there's an enormous opportunity with this new market of a decarbonized economies.
Oh, thanks for sharing that, Nicola. That's a fabulous example of the complexity of the challenge, but the role that data can play in that. So that's awesome. Thanks. Tell us what you think. Rate the episode at oracle.com/trending topics.